All right. Thanks for coming at this relatively late hour. We're going to talk about co-owned AI. And at this point, that's probably a term I totally made up. So we'll see where it goes. Something about my background. So I have a decent amount of experience in economics, crypto, and AI, sort of at the intersection of it, partially through working on Autonolas. Autonolas allows you to build DAO-owned decentralized backends. Valerie is the labs behind Autonolas, and our long-term focus is on this idea of co-owned AI, which I'll introduce you to. I think the key point is that we are in an acceleration phase when it comes to technology, and we better don't fuck it up. And so that's what this is all about at the end of the day. So when you recently were on Twitter, you might have occasionally felt like this. At least some people did, I'm sure, when they saw the recent advances in AI, particularly with ChatGPT and other similar products. But what if we co-owned AI? So we'll look into this today. The structure of my talk is that we'll define what the heck co-owned AI is. And we'll then think about how DAOs are the primal form of this concept of co-owned AI. We'll look at some of the challenges and limitations of co-owned AI. And then I'll present some high-level ideas of how co-owned AI could be realized on an architectural and software level. And then we'll conclude. Now, as we are early in this journey, I invite all of you to come later to push back on all those points. That would be great. So for completeness, we need to always define what we're talking about. Here's a definition of AI. There are many, but that's a relatively non-technical one. So it's the idea of using computers to mimic what we can do with our brain. Now, the idea of co-owned AI is that, at least that's how we define it, an AI system that jointly is owned and controlled by multiple parties. We'll pick this apart in a moment because there's a lot of ways we could define co-owned AI, and it might help to pick this apart a bit. Before I get into the detailed definition, I want to introduce some pictures which we'll use throughout. Basically, the idea is to make clear for a general audience what is different between what we would currently consider an AI program versus how co-owned AI could look like. So on the left, we have this triangle. Basically, the idea is just to represent a distributed computer program or AI program. It could also potentially run in the same place, on the same machine, or on several machines. But there's one purple person on each corner, and that gives you the idea that it's owned by the same entity. All right? On the right-hand side, we have basically 6 different entities owning one node each in the system. And so that's really the core idea. I want you to keep in mind that these software programs we're talking about are intelligent, but they're also owned by different parties. So we have a degree of decentralization. So let's do a somewhat methodological comparison of traditional AI and co-owned AI. So if we look at ownership, then the idea would be that in the AI we're comfortable with, usually there's a single entity which owns the IP, collects the revenue. In co-owned AI, that would be, for instance, a DAO. So there's ultimately a set of smart contracts governed by a bunch of people who co-own the whole system. But it could also be in a sort of traditional sense where It's just a bunch of companies coordinating in a consortium or a bunch of people coordinating in a different way than with smart contracts. Operational control, again, difference between single entity and collective. So then we get into development. Here, we already have in traditional AI attempts to decentralize this. I'll give some examples in a second. In co-owned AI, it would by definition have to be decentralized to some degree, at least at the level of a consortia or potentially further, like totally open source, open access. Similar with training, today we can already do this, but usually there's a certain amount of control over the data set. In co-owned AI, there would probably be open access or consortia. Then we get to deployment. That's actually the most interesting part of this whole matrix because it's often overlooked. Deployment has several parts to it. There's the inference and serving. So for instance, if you go to ChatGPT, you call like one API and it will serve you your response, right? And that is fully centralized, owned by one company. You could imagine a system where that is no longer so, where there's effectively a decentralization layer in between. This becomes particularly interesting when we think about actuating, i.e. doing things, when the AI system actually goes out into the world and takes action itself. So ChatGPT at the moment doesn't do this. You go there, it serves you a response, that's it. It probably stays in the box. You go back and you do it again. An actuating AI would go out into the world, actually do things. Then governance is pretty obvious that if I have a single entity controlling it, it's autocratic. Whereas if we have multiple entities controlling it, it's democratic and participatory. And then transparency and auditability is basically zero when we come to things like traditional AI. I mean, a company can tell you they're running A, but they're actually running B. So open sourcing technology doesn't actually make a difference. You don't actually know what they're running. With co-owned AI, the idea would be that you can go up to a consortium or fully decentralize it, make it public. So this is not to be meant to be like black or white. I totally appreciate that companies today and entities today sit on a spectrum there. And that's natural. And in particular, if you think about the different rows, they would always sit on a spectrum across those rows. So for instance, Stability AI, that's the company behind these great generative models for imagery, for instance. They have a centralized deployment mode, like either you run it locally or on their hosted instance, but the development is relatively decentralized and the models are open source. OpenAI open sources some of their model, and then there's an interesting one. Together, they basically do decentralized training. So we already have like variants of co-owned AI in the wild. Now, before I get into the DAO aspect of it, I just want to show you the good side of things with respect to co-owned AI. So one of this is shared decision making. The key here is that this allows for more input of different perspectives. We can see this in DAOs, and we probably want it in powerful AI systems too. Democratic decision making is speaking to the point earlier that it brings transparency to the decision making progress, but also legitimacy. Especially as these systems become more powerful, this is also potentially a requirement for acceptance in societies. Then we have transparency and auditability. Transparency, it's a lot about preventing biases, being able to look into biases, being able to look at the data which is being used. Auditability, trust and verify, we know it from crypto. Collaboration, it's very important to be able to collaborate on the development of those technologies to get different perspectives in, which co-owned AI would enable. And I don't want to go through the whole list. The slides are available, but one on the right-hand side is particularly important, is around share returns from power laws. So as we see with exponential technology, the rewards tend to centralize enormously. And so being able to co-own extremely powerful technology can be very beneficial for the stability of the societies we live in. And the extreme form of this is obviously offering co-owned AI as a public good. So getting back to what Gitcoin is doing and so on. And that sort of brings me to DAOs. So I think DAOs, in a way, at least the protocol ones, the ones which are mostly there in code, are in a way serving as the primitives of this kind of idea of co-owned AI. They give us a lot of the things which I listed earlier. So for instance, transparent and secure governance, we already have this enabled via DAOs. Democratic and participatory decision making, the token-based ownership and control, i.e. owning a share of the system. And also this idea that the development of the system can come from a lot of entities in a collaborative way and in an unforeseen way. Finally, the fact that DAOs operate on a decentralized substrate obviously gives them a lot of resilience and also flexibility. And some of these could be leveraged in this concept of co-owned AI. So I want to give some concrete examples of what maybe could be considered the early sort of examples of co-owned AI. So for instance, Gitcoin DAO, what they do is they have this passport system which basically verifies your unique humanity. It basically has a scoring algorithm, and one could very easily see how that over time becomes extremely complex. Ocean DAO, Bacalao, and Nevermind are all examples of like very specific protocols which either focus around compute or data access management, which kind of provide building blocks for this concept. And then the protocol I work on myself, which offers this decentralized ownable off-chain backend. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. If you have more to add, please reach out. I'll happily add it to the list. Before we go into the concrete examples of what this might look like, I want to quickly give an overview of the limitations of these primal forms, the DAOs, basically. So if you look at the protocol DAOs today, then the complexity of decision-making means that there's often a high cost to doing anything in this kind of structure. If you look at further the decision-making process, there's also this problem that it's quite hard to achieve consensus, which can lead to enormous inefficiencies in the system, coupled with the fact that actually DAOs often don't have a gating element, or like kind of expertise isn't often leveraged to the fullest, which can lead to enormous ineffectiveness in the DAO. Finally, on the technical side and legal side, they're intertwined. So particularly as DAOs reach out more into the off-chain space and have more central processes like bots or scripts which people are running, they effectively become these targets for regulatory and liability actions, right? If I'm the single developer in a DAO running a bot, that's not a good idea, right? Generally speaking. So the more we can do to address these problems will also help us in progressing co-owned AI as its final form. So to be concrete, here a little task list for all of us to work on. Basically, we need to reduce governance to the minimum necessary and increase the autonomous decision-making. That has a nice byproduct that usually it means auditability and transparency just come for free because you have to implement things in as much code as possible. We want to remove manual and ad hoc processes if we want to have actual autonomous operations. A lot of even protocol DAOs aren't actually that autonomous after all. If the core team goes home tomorrow, the thing will stop. And the token holders often don't have any recourse to steering the DAO away from that disaster. We also need to make decision-making processes clearer and educate members. That's particularly important as the institution, as the system becomes more complex. It can help in those contexts to basically use AI to explain AI and explain the DAO basically to its members. Robustness and security are important in all cases, not just when we're talking about co-owned AI, but they kind of extend into the idea, particularly when the co-owned AI progresses to higher degrees of intelligence, potentially one day general intelligence, where it really becomes, and particularly when it can actuate into the world, i.e. take action outside its protocol context, then it becomes very important to think about this also from an AI safety point of view. And in order to achieve truly co-owned AI, we always need to increase decentralization at all layers. That doesn't necessarily mean that everything happens on-chain, and we'll talk about this in a second. So here's a general architectural blueprint for what a co-owned AI might look like one day. There's an on-chain DAO which secures and governs the system. There's an off-chain autonomous system, which is also a node system, but it's basically focused on compute. It provides the ML workloads, aggregates maybe subroutines, sub-AI system, and coordinates them. And over time, we can think of adding, the latest technological innovations around zero-knowledge technology and so on to increase the verifiability of different sub-aspects of the system. But the key idea is that a lot of co-owned AI actually lives off-chain. So one example, which seems sort of obvious, is that you have an ensemble AI. So here, what you effectively do is each node runs its own AI subprogram, for instance, an LLM, a large language model, which could generate some sub-part of the request or the whole request. And then before actuating or serving, there's a stage of consensus met between the subparts of the system, which can kind of counteract potential harm if designed so. This could potentially also help us align AI. In particular, we can very much see this on-chain already. If the AI system were constrained to only act on-chain, then via smart contracts, we can basically box it in, right? Now that doesn't work as easily off-chain, that's obvious. But maybe that sparks some innovation. Then this one is sort of, I think what will actually happen is basically the sort of multi-layer hybrid. So the idea here is that the on-chain DAO secures and governs, the off-chain system aggregates heavy and does some heavy compute, but most of the actual AI system lives far out on the edge and sort of brings back subroutines, sub-results, and it lives there for speed and efficiency. In the end, we can therefore have a network of such AIs. This is where it becomes interesting because they can basically form entire economies. And so this will then also allow us to potentially generate such returns that it becomes straightforward to operate some of those AIs as public goods, effectively. So I see that I'm out of time, so basically I just kind of want to outline that this is just a concept. However, we are kind of working on the foundations of it. We are bringing more capabilities for DAOs to own their off-chain processes. And the long-term vision there is for them to basically own their off-chain AI systems and kind of govern them on-chain and then see where this evolves. So maybe there's hope, we'll see. And if you are interested in contributing, we've got this very cool domain. You can go to it, and there's a type form. And we are happy to work with any and all projects who have any interest in this space. Reach out, and we'll create basically a Discord to collaborate on this problem. Thank you for your attention.